Hi, we would like to welcome everyone to the How and Why of DE&I Implementing Inclusion Plans in Bar Associations. We're thrilled to have all of you with us today. We'd like to thank you, the participants, our sponsors, ABA-YLD leadership, and ABA staff for putting this program together. My name is Larissa Mañón Mervin. I'll be serving as your moderator, and I serve under the leadership of Daryl Wilson, the DE&I director for the ABA-YLD. This is part of a 4-part series seeking to tackle the importance of DE&I plans with an emphasis on inclusion plans. Our panelists will dive into how to develop inclusion plans, their content and development and application, and we'll learn how inclusion plans can develop current lawyers and the next generation of lawyers with a focus on ensuring the success of historically underrepresented attorneys. As I mentioned, today's panels specifically focus on implementing inclusion plans in bar associations. While it's obviously important that the legal profession continue to attract diverse attorneys, it's equally important that those attorneys feel welcome, valued, and included in bar associations and have the opportunity for various leadership experiences within bar associations. We'll focus on what bar associations can do and are already doing to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we create buy-in in those organizations when many of them are largely made up of volunteers. Before we begin, we've reserved some time for question and answers at the end of the program and ask that you submit any questions through the questions function in Zoom. At this time, I'd love to introduce our wonderful panelists. We have Jerome Crawford, who's the Director of Legal Operations and Social Equity at Pleasantrees in Detroit, Michigan. He also serves as the ABA-YLD Public Service Director. We also have Sarah Saint with us. She's an attorney with Brooks Pierce in Greensboro, North Carolina. She serves in both the ABA and NCBA, North Carolina Bar Association. Through the ABA, she's the current YLD, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Committee Chair, and the incoming Personnel and Policy Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. In the North Carolina Bar Association, she serves as the current YLD Administrative Division Director and the inaugural chair of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Committee, and a member of the Task Force on Equity and Integration, and as the co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Subcommittee of the Pro Bono Committee. Shenique Moss, pronoun she, her, hers, is the Director of Compliance for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. She served as a past ABA-YLD Diversity Director and a past State Bar of Michigan Young Lawyer Section Diversity Committee Chair. She has also been a member of the ABA's Council for Diversity in the Educational Pipeline and the ABA Judicial Division Standing Committee on Diversity in the state of Michigan's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. I'd also like to welcome Jess Waltman, pronoun he, him. He's an attorney with Davis and Crump in Gulfport, Mississippi. He also is the president-elect for the Mississippi Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. And last but not least, Bria Kemp, deputy prosecuting attorney for the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, where she also serves as vice chair on strategy and impact for their DE&I Council. She serves as Region 8 Ambassador for ABA-YLD and sits on the Alumni Advisory Board for the Midwest Balsa region. So as you can see, we have a group of very talented, brilliant, and very involved panelists. So I'm excited to hear what all of them have to tell us about implementing inclusion plans in bar associations. So to kick things off, could each person take a turn briefly discussing where your bar associations are currently with implementing DE&I plans? Jerome, we'll start with you.
I think that's my cue. You saw I tried to work my way out of it. You know, in the pregame, what you all don't know is everyone's like drawing straws to figure out who's going to speak first. Pleasure to sit on this illustrious panel with my colleagues, and thank you all for joining us, and to everyone that was a part of putting this together, thank you for having us. To kick things off, and I'll talk about it, everyone's going to have different things, bar associations or organizations that we use kind of as our fodder, you know, for the discussion. And yes, ABA and YLD's already taken, so that's not where I'm going to speak from, as we have those that are far better suited than myself, I think, to share some of that perspective. Mine is going to be a bit of a hybrid. Where that comes from, one end is the State Bar of Michigan Young Lawyers section, where I've sat on the executive council for the last 9 years or so. As well as the Wolverine Bar Association, which is actually an affiliate of the National Bar Association, but is an affinity bar historically for Black lawyers, judges, law students. I was on that board for about 8 years, and most recently the president in 2019. So now when you're part of, I think, a minority affinity bar, it's pretty obvious. It's one of those things that those type of organizations, you guys don't ever do plans, right? Because they say our purpose, our mission is all, it's us, who we are, right? The essence of who we are and why we were founded. Conversely, not saying that's a good thing. I think sometimes you still have to put intentional effort around that to maintain the purpose. That's one anecdote I'll say from a Wolverine Bar WBA perspective. To speak about it from the State Bar of Michigan YLS standpoint, what happens there is because the young lawyers section is one of the many sections of the State Bar. Our diversity plan, diversity efforts fall largely under sort of the umbrella of what State Bar of Michigan does sort of at large, and having its own diversity channel, its own plan. They have diversity and inclusion advisory council committees, work groups, things of that nature. So ours is kind of a, sort of a waterfall of that. We also have our own diversity committee, which I've chaired kind of off and on for about 6 years. And that's where a lot of our efforts, I think, take place. So when it comes to from a plan standpoint, that ours is unique in that because we're part of that larger bar. And again, we're not, we're a mandatory bar from a State Bar of Michigan standpoint. And even also interesting is that young lawyer section is also mandatory in the sense that you're automatically enrolled in the young lawyer section merely by your age and or your years of practice. So our membership is unique. It's not like they're signing up for labor and employment because they care about it, right? You're just young, right? Or you're new to practice. So getting buy-in, I think will be a little bit difficult. But when it comes to the committee itself, a lot of our executive council, Shenique Moss, who also served in the capacity we did for a while, and as we mentioned, State Bar of Michigan Lower Section together, a lot of it is effectuated through those council members. So when we think about, our plan itself, our plan, I think, is a little bit more esoteric. Our plan is one that it happens more in action with respect to that organization as opposed to actually being written down. I can tell you, though, the written down approach is always the best way, just like writing your goals down and what you want to get done this year. And I've had the privilege to do that in other organizations such as ABA YLD, right? Working on our most recent diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, and how we go about our efforts beyond just sort of mission statements and things like that, which we definitely have at that SBM, YLS level. And then even seeing a more professional context where I do in my day job, at Pleasantrees, what we call a social equity plan, which I'll weave in some future comments. So with that, I've taken the brunt on, I've taken the first one. I'm gonna get off the mic and shut up, but that's a little bit of context from that standpoint, Larissa.
No, that was helpful. Thank you. I appreciate you going through all of that.
Okay.
Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to piggyback off something off that Jerome said about, when you have DEI plans and then sometimes where it's just built into the existence of an organization. So as Larissa was saying, I'm involved both in the North Carolina Bar Association's task force on integration, equity, and equal justice, which I always butcher that name, but I think that's the official name, as well as the inaugural chair of the North Carolina Bar Association's Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Committee, SOGI, which is the first time that the NCBA has created an affinity group related to the LGBTQ community, which I'm very, very excited about. So I want to talk about those things separately. The task force came about through a lot of work done by the NCBA in figuring out what sort of DEI plan it needed. There had been some research done by the University of North Carolina on a governor of North Carolina, Charles Aycock, who was instrumental in the founding of the NCBA, who was also instrumental in a whole lot of horrifying abuses against Black people across North Carolina. And so as a result, the NCBA was founded on white supremacist ideals and was limited to white attorneys, I think, until the 1960s, 1965. And so the NCBA has been, that developed this task force and a separate task force to look at and address, this is information we now have and information that we need to do something about. And so what are we going to do to grapple with that legacy and with that history and move the organization forward? So the other piece of the NCBA's plan is looking at removing some vestiges of known white supremacists who were instrumental in founding the NCBA and other lawyers who have been celebrated throughout the NCBA over time, and removing their recognitions and changing the way that we talk about those folks in our bar association. So that's one task force that's working on that. I'm on a separate task force that is focused on elevating the work of attorneys of color, particularly Black attorneys in North Carolina, and moving forward with kind of the next steps of, okay, we have this history and we need to address that, but then how are we going to be a more inclusive place that is welcoming to attorneys of color and other historically excluded attorneys? And so I'm very excited to be a part of that task force. We're only a year in our work, so we're still at the very beginning stages of the work on that and developing plans for that, and a DEI plan coming out of that. We are making recommendations to our Board of Governors, which they'll hear in a couple of weeks at the NCBA annual meeting, and we'll be off to the races at that point. So I'm excited about the work that's being done, but it is in its early stages. I think as a whole, NCBA spent a lot of time thinking about who we are. And then I also want to talk about the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Committee. As Jerome said, we don't have a DEI plan because that is our whole mission, is to provide a kind of a safe house for North Carolina attorneys who are LGBTQ or ally to have a home, to know where they can go to feel included as we continue to move the organization forward. And I'll talk more about that as we answer other questions, and I'll turn it over to our next panelist.
Thank you, Sarah. That was good to give that historical context too, and like why these plans are necessary in several of the bar associations. Shenique Moss.
Sure, thank you, Larissa. And I apologize. I'm hoping that my internet continues because it's like torrential downpour here, like lightning, thunder, off the whole works. But today I'll talk mostly about the Lawyers Conference of the Judicial Division and kind of like the Judicial Division as a whole, and the steps that they're taking in the lines of DEI. And I'll like touch a little bit on the ABA-YLD, although I'm no longer a member of the division, having aged out a couple of years ago. I was extremely involved, serving as diversity director at one point in time, as speaker, and also as the Young Lawyers Division rep to the nominating committee. With respect to the Lawyers Conference of the Judicial Division, I kind of got my start there actually as liaison from the Young Lawyers Division. And what kind of kept me actively engaged was just their commitment to diversity. Now, the Judicial Division, they have a diversity plan. I believe it was created somewhere around 2004. And it's a plan that, it's a living document. So they take, every year they look at it and see, kind of like where are we in our mission, in our plan, and like, we'll try to make adjustments as needed. They've been really intentional about making sure that they're welcoming to diverse members, as well as, providing spaces and channels for them to access leadership opportunities. And so even though the judiciary as a whole, many argue, and I would agree, is not as diverse as it should be and not reflective of the population, I will say that the Judicial Division as a whole is. The other way that they really try to make a difference is increasing the pipeline. So a lot of the programs that they do are geared towards young people. And that's something that you can always see with them. I think they do a really good job of that. With respect to the Young Lawyers Division for the ABA, I think that since I've been involved, maybe 15 years ago, they've always had a diversity plan, and they've periodically reviewed it to see if there needs to be some adjustments and tweaks. I think we do a pretty good job of getting members in through like programs like the Scholars Program, which I know they're changing the name next year, but that's a really good avenue to get lawyers who might not traditionally become involved with the ABA and leadership opportunities to get more involved. I think sometimes where we struggle is maybe not creating a space where diverse attorneys feel as welcome. And so I know that we sometimes have diverse attorneys kind of fall off. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that we kind of do a better job of just creating a more welcoming space. And I mean, I think that we are definitely kind of on our way. And I think that there's definitely buy-in from leadership, but I think there's room for improvement in that area. And I'll talk more about that as we go further along. But I think that, I mean, the first step in any initiative is to at least create a plan and see where you identify the problem. And I think we've done that, and just look for ways that we can continue to improve upon that. So I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Shenique. I appreciate that. Jess?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jess Waltman, and as my slide indicated earlier, I am an attorney with Davis and Crump in Gulfport, Mississippi. And I'm also the chair-elect of the Mississippi Young Lawyers Division. And you probably saw me as I was looking over and checking my statistics, because as Mark Twain said, there are lies, damn lies, in statistics. And I wanted to bring some numbers to you from the Mississippi Bar, specifically the Young Lawyers Division. And I'll get to that in just a second, because the Young Lawyers Division is a mandatory division of a mandatory bar. And the Mississippi Bar has a committed diversity statement that was revised just in March of this past year, or just in March of this year. And we also released our diversity portion of our strategic plan. And we all know that there is more work to be done. And I'm a firm believer that we need to leave the Bar Association in a better position than when we found it. There's still a lot of work that can be done as far as making it a more welcoming and inclusive bar association. Part of that is also about making Mississippi a more inclusive and welcoming state. Some of the statistics that I'd like to talk about later in the program involve certain minority groups, be they either gender identity and sexual orientation groups or racial groups. We don't have representation in our bar association because we don't have representation of those minority groups in our profession in the state of Mississippi. It's disappointing, but we have a lot of less than 1% as far as certain demographics go. But really quickly, I'd like to talk about specifically what YLD does. YLD is, Mississippi YLD. We have 16 committee chairs, and 72% of those committee chairs are held by women. 22% of those are held by African Americans. And that is in comparison to 30% of our YLD membership who are women, and 26% of our YLD membership who are African American. And I would love to give more statistics on that, but we just don't have the membership. I mean, it would be 0, 0, 0 across the board. But we are committed to making changes in the right direction. So with that in mind, the YLD has a diversity and social justice committee who focuses on diversity and social justice in 3 areas. One is racial diversity, specifically regarding underserved and underrepresented minority groups based on their race, be it African American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or Hispanic. Again, for 2 of those 3, we have fewer than 1% practicing attorneys in the state of Mississippi. So we don't even track those numbers. The second is diversity and inclusion based on gender identity and sexual orientation. And the third is diversity in the sense of attorneys who are differently abled. Mississippi Bar does actually not track diverse attorneys in that way, differently abled attorneys at all. So if someone was to say how many Mississippi attorneys are in wheelchairs and need special access to courthouses, no one can give you an answer on that because we do not track it. And that's something that we are going to be looking into remedying in my bar year. But with that being said, I will yield my time.
Thanks, Jess. Bria?
There we go. Thank you. So as I stated, I am Bria Kemp. I am currently in Indianapolis, Indiana. I will go through what all of the bar associations that I'm part of are doing. So of course, the National Bar Association, they have a lot of programming and mentors and training programs, sponsorships that allow not just attorneys, but law students to get involved, to get into spaces that allow us to know what we're getting into first as a law student before we get into profession. And then as a profession, being able to address the issues that arise with DE&I, having a space to go to and talk to other attorneys and see how to deal with conversations that come up in different situations. One of the most recent ones that was a conversation, I was talking with the chair of the YLD, which I'll go to next, was a conversation about when you're going for jobs and hiring and what your appearance should be like, how should your hair be, what clothing do you wear, etc. So there's definitely conversations that are having. CLE is, of course, addressing this issue. The NBA is also having their annual NBA Associate Advancement Academy for Excellence. And that program was partnered with Arnold and Porter and their foundation to help redress retention issues in the nation's largest law firms. Where that way they're able to, the academy is tailored for career advancement, academy for the Black associates within the first 3 years of the practice. And it's developed with support of the NBA's minority partners, in the majority firm divisions, the young lawyer divisions, commercial law section, and corporate law section. So they've all come together to try to help with this retention issue that you see when it comes to big law. The academy includes anything from educational and networking, mentoring, pro bono or community service involvement in components. And it ranges to a fair amount of other categories. They address things like autonomy in big law, legal research and writing skills, which help no matter where you're at in the law field, and which can also be a hindrance if you are not good, especially with legal research and legal writing. Mental health, fitness, and accounting one-on-one, stuff like that. So the academy helps with that. They also have a fellowship that goes along with all of this. So that's the NBA. And then part of the NBA, there is a Young Lawyers Division. As stated, I'm the Region 7 ambassador for that. With us, we do a lot of pipeline efforts, doing a lot of mentoring, doing a lot of engagement. We research in each of our individual ambassador geographical locations. We find out how many different affiliate bar associations there are and try to reach out to all the YLD groups and figure out what are the conversations being had, what are the meetups, whether virtual or in person, what are the different things that, issues that are being brought that may be addressed, may not be addressed, just to keep up, across the nation with what's happening in DEI and what's happening with us more specifically in the advancement of this profession. We have the pipeline to help with recruitment of diverse college students and those who may not know that going to law school and being a part of the profession is an option. So we, try to attack them younger and expose them to the possibility of being in this profession. And then, of course, expose the youth to attorneys of color. A lot of us don't see attorneys of color until you might get into law school or go to a diverse meetup where there are attorneys. Encourage literacy so that we can encourage the educational background and help them with that. And it also explain what lawyers do. A lot of times you don't see, when you talk to high schoolers or even you talk to some undergrads, they don't know what an attorney does, what they're able to do, what's the difference between a lawyer and an attorney. These are questions that unless you have the education behind it and the knowledge, you don't know. They're all the same thing to you. Next, I am a part of the Indiana State Bar Association. They actually have a whole page dedicated to addressing systematic inequalities in the justice system. And they have a full page of their plan and their program. They do revisited. It seems like every year to try to update that, see what new questions have arisen, what new answers were given, any problems that have come. So they do seem to keep up on that. It is a environment to where they try to create a safe space for all its members to foster the support. It is a continuous working effort on their action plan. Every month, they have an open conversation that addresses racism and racial inequality and injustice. So that way you can come. It is a virtual meetup. So you can go to that forum and be able to discuss anything. It's led by our Supreme Court Justice, Stephen David, and then an attorney, Anika Henshaw. So you have that also where you can go every month and do that. They have a fair amount of other things that they do. They try to be as inclusive as possible. We also, whenever we know about events, those are newspapers or we have Flash where we go and expose anything that's going on revolving around DE&I to get the support and to get the attendance. And then lastly, I am a part of the Marion County Bar Association. That was founded in 1926 in Indianapolis, Indiana. It is a chapter of the National Bar Association. And that one it's a lot of networking, a lot of possibilities. They do leadership opportunities there, mentoring, community building. They have a classified job listing on the page to where we do see, especially like when I was in law school, they will send out job listings where we're trying to get the field more diverse and putting them into these majority Black group me's or chats to expose, because a lot of times if it's not a word of mouth thing, we don't have the access to be able to know where to go to get into other fields in the law that's not criminal justice. So there's the pipelines to the communication to expose more information, as well as the support behind it of dealing with the profession, having the more intimate sit downs of the DEI issues that arise on a day-to-day in the practice. And I will.
Wow, that's awesome. It's great to hear from all of you about what your, bar associations are doing and the strategies they're implementing to create and implement inclusion plans. I have a question about implicit bias. We often find that affinity bias or implicit bias kind of prevents attorneys who are historically underrepresented from feeling welcome in the profession and bar associations. What are your bar associations doing to kind of help with that, help attorneys feel welcome and also rid kind of the bar association of implicit bias? And whoever wants to go first, or I will just go in the same order.
I guess I can go. So the Judicial Division, they do a lot of CLE, not necessarily like inwardly facing to the association, but I think that is like an added benefit. A lot of the efforts that they do around implicit bias is making sure or trying to ensure that members of the judiciary kind of are aware of any implicit biases they may have. And so they do a lot of CLEs and other seminars kind of like around that area. And so that's kind of how they are taking it on. Like, I'm not aware of like anything that is specifically geared kind of inwardly facing to the association. Like I said, I do think that, knowledge is the first step. You don't know what you don't know. And so if you're aware of it, I think you could apply it to different facets of your life.
Yeah, Shenique, I think that's a really good point and something that's important for me, especially as I'm moving forward with the SOGI committee, not forgetting that historically excluded attorneys also have implicit biases and making sure there's a lot of intersectionality among any sort of affinity bar associations and taking stock of yourself as well as creating that, I think, space to recharge. You can do everything you can to work on implicit bias within the large association, but man, it is good to just get in a room full of attorneys that are like you and to have that home to recharge and reinvigorate yourself to be able to volunteer and give back and keep trying to move the needle on this really big issue of creating inclusive bar associations. And then Bria, I think this was your point earlier about not seeing attorneys of color when you're a high school student or before you ever go to law school. I think that's very true, but I also think that's true in the profession, period, that a lot of times folks aren't seeing people who look like them up the letterhead of their organizations or in the same practice areas of them. And something that's really great that a lot of the affinity groups within the NCBA do is have a list of kind of experts in different areas of the law to suggest CLE speakers to different sections. So like the education section or the labor and employment section or the antitrust section, here is a list of attorneys of color, LGBTQ attorneys who can speak in these areas to elevate voices that don't always get elevated in a space that is predominantly white male. So I think that's been a great way, maybe not to get rid of implicit bias, but at least to just, have people front and center that who are experts in their field that aren't talking about diversity issues all the time, right? We can talk about other stuff too.
And if I can jump in really quickly, I think Sarah hit the nail on the head. There's power in just talking about it. There are attorneys who I would consider, I don't even know how to say this, but I would consider them to be attorneys who would not intentionally display bias. Like they would not intentionally make these decisions, but they're making decisions and they don't even know that they're making these decisions. And when you bring it up to them, they sit back and say, oh, well, I didn't know that's what I was doing. And it's something as simple as just saying, hey, like this is a real thing that happens. There's power in that. And one thing that we try to do is we offer 12 hours of CLE to everyone who's been newly admitted to the Mississippi Bar. And 2 of those hours involve our professional responsibilities to the courts and to other attorneys. And we try to work in at least every other one of those CLEs, at least a quarter of the content being related to reducing implicit bias.
No, I'll take an interesting dovetail that Sarah illuminated, and my brain was already here, and you solidified it for me. And that is that minority attorneys, right, marginalized groups, underrepresented groups also have biases. But there's sometimes this unwritten understanding that like, hey, like the brown folks are going to hang together, right? Because you're doing your thing here, right? Oh, hey, you're a minority group too. Hey, we're going to hang out, right? And you all are together. So, you know, the challenge I think at times is for, and I speak from the affinity bar standpoint, as you said, Sarah, like I think that we have, you know, we may not have like our own plan oftentimes because it's presumed in our purpose and who we are. How we operate says a lot about standards we set. By way of example, Wolverine Bar Association, it's a 103-year-old organization now, right? And the irony of, even though it's pretty much said and understood, this bar is for Black folks, right? Let's just put it like layman's terms, kind of how it's understood, right? Lawyers, law students, judges. Well, over time, right, as diaspora continues to change, you realize that Blackness is maybe not just skin color, but culture as well. And so there's certain people that may identify with that culture. They might also be a minority too. We started to see this pop up in some of our programming that we put out there. By way of example, we have 2. One is our scholarship program. The other one is our summer clerkship, judicial externship program. So the latter has pretty prestigious placements, right? You're going to end up at one of the larger law firms in the state out of your 1L years, a rising 2L, which is just uncommon for a law student in general, right? And or a placement with a federal judge in Eastern District of Michigan, right? That's a big thing. So guess who wants to apply for that? Everybody, right? So naturally, then we'd start getting people coming in the door. And there was this, I've been on boards, and every board was like a different feelings from some years, and was like, no, just the people and the purpose. And it was like, well, I mean, like they're pretty much like they rock with Black people. They're at the cookout, so to speak, right? And so it's this really interesting dynamic that we have to, I think, adopt as leaders of the organization to not be exclusionary. How do you maintain your purpose while simultaneously not being exclusionary? So I think this question is great about being welcoming and understanding that there's some people that, and you know, they almost have this little bit of this vetting, if you will, right? To be able to understand, like, if someone maybe just using this from a platform standpoint, all they want is the opportunity, or will they be committed to these causes? Because in every cause, and we're talking about marginalized groups, allies are essential, right? And you want to talk about the civil rights movement, it gets nowhere if you don't have allies that don't look like MLK, right? And don't look like Malcolm X. You have to have people that didn't look like those that, so to speak, were the ones fighting for the causes to be supportive. So I think it's important to how do you find a way to empower, you know, the groups you want to represent and the causes you fight for while simultaneously not being exclusionary. So having that welcoming mindset matters. Just making sure it's a balance, right? Because every single year was tough where we'd get feedback from some of our, you know, kind of OG lawyers, if you will, that were in the firms and saying like, well, man, half of that class, if you will, was like actually identified as Black type of thing, right? And was that a failure on the board's leadership that year because the applicant pool, frankly, didn't even, reflect it? So, and those were super qualified folks. So there's this tough balance, but I think that welcoming starts with, you know, a spirit of understanding common struggle. And it's something that sort of Sarah was alluding to, Jess alluding to, and one that I would definitely put at the forefront.
So definitely agree with Shenique, the CLEs, where you do get some of the conversations as well as the education. And then yes, understanding that even minorities do have implicit biases. And jumping into what Jerome said, you kind of took my point of those more intimate settings of having our own personal standards of how do we conduct ourselves and what do we prescribe to and live by. Because a lot of times for example, was just talking to someone and they were going to an interview, and I had mentioned it earlier about how should she wear her hair. She had just got her hair braided and literally finished a few hours before the interview. And it's like, do I wear braids for an interview? And you had some people saying, no, you don't. And you do that after you get hired. And the others are like, no, like if they can't take you for who you are, then that's not an environment you want to be in, to where you have to worry about you as a person and not what you bring to the table. How are you an asset to this this corporation or whatever it is, this group, this meeting, etc. So, we do have our own conversations. And I think that the intimate conversations are we're pointing to where you find that comfort level of being able to address implicit biases, whether it's personal ones or the ones you have seen other people do. And if you form those relationships, being able to have those intimate conversations of bringing it to light, like Jess said, because sometimes people don't understand what's happening or how it is an implicit bias, because all of them are not explicit. And being able to have those conversations of awareness, so that way they have the knowledge to where they can do something different in the future and address it, so that it's not a perpetuating circle that never stops because it's never been addressed.
Bria is about to take us to a Crown Act discussion, and I'm all the way here for it. I just want to know that I'm 100%. I'm down for it. As a guy with locks in the room, like 100%. Like it didn't even hit me until I was growing my hair when the Crown Act was really getting place. And I think that's a great point, though, just about back to the acceptance, right? Who do you allow to sit in certain seats and roles? I never forget when I first time I went in-house, and the judge, a friend of mine, was like, "Oh, you got that in-house hair." And I said, "What?" And I had a high top fade, like, right? And she's an older Black woman, right? And I'm like, "Well, I guess." And then I appreciate living boldly. I mean, my industry, I'm in the cannabis industry, I'm a legal drug dealer. Like I do this stuff tongue in cheek on purpose, but it's also to break down barriers and biases. And I love that. I love that, like, authenticity. All of us bring a version of ourselves places. The more authentically I think we live in our bar associations, of course, but also in our workplaces, has impact and that acceptance. Like Jess said, our pool is only so big, Mississippi, so I can only get you what I can get you, right? So I got to increase the pipeline in the pool, right? And I think it starts with allowing people to be themselves and to feel accepted, feel welcome.
That's great. I love that. How have your bar associations, how has the leadership, I should say, in your bar associations supported inclusion plans, and what sort of incentives have they offered to actually implement them?
I will start with the first question. The second question, either I don't know anything about what the incentives are, or there may not be any. And I'm just going to leave that one there. But to the first question, in the NCBA, I mean, the task force were created by the Board of Governors. They were created by the leadership. And so incredibly supportive of that and of the work that the Racial Equity Task Force are working on. And then in terms of starting the SOGI committee and the NCBA, it took about a year and a half to go from first conversation with the then president of the NCBA to implementation with the now president of the NCBA, not because there's any pushback or anything at all, but because things take time and bar associations. I'm sure everybody on this call can be like, yep, sometimes things take longer than you want them to. But creating a committee apparently was quite the process that I embarked on without knowing how long of a process I was getting myself into. But the whole time, the leadership, the president and the executive director and the Board of Governors were helping that along to get to the point. And so, I think the feedback that I got along the way was, oh, I'm surprised we don't already have this. I'm surprised, that's weird to me that we need this, or that it doesn't already exist. But so yes, of course, let's get the ball rolling. So the leadership has been incredibly supportive on both of those fronts, and really leading the charge on the Racial Equity Task Force side, which is great.
So for the Judicial Division, I think that they've diversity has definitely, and inclusion has definitely kind of been at the forefront of the various leaders of the division as far as their mindset. And for our diversity plan, one of the things that the nominating committee takes into account is like diversity, and they try to make sure that, the division and its leadership is diverse, and I think they do a really good job of that. I think the YLD does as well. I think one of the things that I, over the years through my various bar involvements, I found has been extremely effective, and is not necessarily, having that we'll have a diverse leadership in a diversity plan, but actually leaders who are in the particular organization reaching out to diverse, members of their association and saying, have you ever thought about leadership? I think you'd be great. Because I think for a lot of diverse lawyers, when they don't necessarily see people who look like them in the leadership structure, they don't know that it's something that they could possibly achieve. And so having someone actually provide that mentorship, provide that, friendly tap on the shoulder to say, have you ever thought about this? You would be excellent in this position. Here are the steps that you need to take in order to get to here. I think that's extremely helpful. And I've tried to do that in all the organizations I belong to, because it's great that I've been able to achieve a certain level of success in the various organizations, I've become a part of and getting to the top of the leadership chain. But if no one looks like me comes after me, then what has an organization really accomplished? And so I've taken it on as a personal charge to make sure that I am keeping the pipeline of diverse leaders full of people who have potential and people who will be great assets to it.
So the incentive, I don't know, but as far as efforts, it is a pipeline effort of going out, having the conversations, giving the exposure, networking. We do a really good job with that. A lot of times it is just a ton of conversations and having the space in place to have the conversations for the YLD and the NBA.
Thank you. So I know this, but a lot of people listening may not. And, different people have different ideas about this. And so help it make sense and tell us how this benefits our communities and our, the citizens or residents of whichever state or county that we're representing. Like, how does having a diverse bar association and diverse leadership within a bar association then trickle into the community and not just help attorneys?
One thing I'll add, and it's been said or alluded to a bit here, in that if you see it, you can be it. And the lack of representation is a huge challenge in our profession in general. And then certainly you have microcosms of that and across various bar associations, which most bar associations are regional in some contexts. Maybe they're state-based, maybe they're more in a particular city, county, and area. And so you have people that, and again, my colleagues here just said it a moment ago, that didn't see a lawyer, right? And maybe growing up didn't have interaction. I didn't come from a lawyer family, right? And so, by way of example, young lawyers section, State Bar Michigan ran an event called the Diversity Mock Trial Program, Diversity Pipeline Mock Trial Program. And that program, we had about 4 iterations of it over several years. And the cool thing about that program was we partnered with local middle schools and even high schools in the area. For many of these students, it was their first interaction with the law, right? Any touch they had with the law, for many of them might have been law enforcement, negative one. One of our years, we actually had students that were part of a program, I think it was called SKIP or something like that. And it was called like students or like kids of incarcerated parents. It was like the acronym there. Shenique gave me the nod, like I'm close to it. But working with that type of organization, right, they'd never seen us as lawyers. So one of the best things we got to do is, yes, we literally had like this complete power pack day where you teach some very high level mock trial skills, how to do an open, how to do a close, here's argument. They, kind of go bracket March Madness style down to a championship round that's held in like the big room. And then we get to do hey, watch us do it. Mind you, we get to play the witnesses for them. So even the fact patterns are fun. It's just that a Mike Tyson, it's like Ike Tyson and stuff like that, right? We had Dustin Bleeber one year. So we played around with it. And it was kind of dope because they got to experience the law in a fun way and say, wow, I might be able to consider doing this one day, right? We asked them a question, have you ever seen a lawyer before? Then we actually would do it for them and kind of like get to kind of showcase. But the best part of the program, as I alluded to, was actually the end of it with the Q&A. where they had law students, lawyers, and judges that looked like them, that they were able to ask questions of in this open kind of 45-minute dialogue. And for many of them, they were so appreciative. You know, the parents that came in later years, when we had parents that would be there and say, wow, we've never had a chance to interact with anybody that is a lawyer in the community. So I think that's a program that the Bar Association did, right, through a majority bar, right? Even though mandatory, like Jess said, same thing, we got things going to Michigan, right? Mandatory state bar, Michigan, mandatory in lower section, but they've been very supportive, to allude to your last question as well, Larissa, of saying, hey, we're down for diversity programming. That program was so successful, excuse me, actually won an ABA award. I'm forgetting the name of the award that we won that year, Shenique, but it was one, like, I think, the second iteration of the program. So that was pretty cool to see that program and then be replicated. We've heard about other iterations of that have happened all over the country. So that's one example of how you can legitimately connect with the community. And our hope is that many of those kids grow up and become attorneys one day.
I think for me too, I think that, I wholeheartedly agree with Jerome that it's important for folks outside the legal profession to see lawyers and judges who are reflective of the population who look like them. I also think there's a benefit when you have diverse bar associations for the lawyers themselves. I know I will say, since the ABA has lawyers from all over the country, you have people who are from like small towns all over, Wyoming or, Montana, where there isn't necessarily a large minority population. And so them being able to come and actually meet and get to know diverse attorneys is also beneficial, because I think sometimes, prejudice and ignorance is based off of just not knowing. And you go off of what you've seen on TV or what you've heard about, or somebody knew somebody who was saying. And that's the same thing for minorities. Like, you have some minorities who live in majority minority areas, and they don't necessarily have interaction with, majority individuals. And so their perception of what a person who belongs to a certain group isn't necessarily based on actual knowledge, is based on like stereotypes or like movies and stuff like that. And so actually having that exposure to people from all walks of life, whether it's like from the LGBTQ plus community or Native American community, or like African American or Hispanic or Pacific Islander, I mean, I think all that is beneficial. So like when they do come into contact with somebody in their daily life, whether they're a judge or whether they're an attorney, having to represent somebody, their perception is actually going to be based off of, maybe what I thought initially isn't actually correct, because, so-and-so like Jerome or Shenique or Larissa or like Sarah, like is like this, and this doesn't necessarily fit within the stereotypical idea of what I had, like that person who belongs to this particular demographic would be like. And so I think it's also important in that aspect as well.
So Jerome had hit the representation, and then Shenique, you just hit the exposure. I wanted to go to the knowledge base, because and Shenique, you started talking about it with, we come from different cities, suburbs, countrysides, etc. And where you're raised, depending on the environment you're in, that's all you know. And usually you're with people who look like you. Now, sometimes there is the mixed neighborhood, stuff like that, but for the majority of time, it's people who think and walk and talk, and you're all the same. So when you have diversity, and this trickles up to when you get older and older, and you get into leadership positions, and you get into going into events and etc. And now here we are, and we're in bar associations. If you have the diversity, the way that is an asset to the community is you have people who represent the smaller sides of the community, because those people also are going to be coming and needing help with the legal field and navigating it and knowing, is this a personal injury claim or is this a med mal? Like, where do I go, etc. But then also there's a trustworthy component that comes into it, because if you have someone that's from the hood, and they're with a suburb attorney, there's that barrier of everything, the third party factors that come into play. You have so much that's a cross barrier to where even trying to understand what this person's trying to explain can be a barrier itself, because there can be a dialect barrier, or a lot of times, some people speak Ebonics, some people don't understand Ebonics, etc. So you have that to where when you do have a more diverse pool to draw from, helping more people in the community becomes more accessible. You're able to reach more people. You're able to do it in a more efficient manner, and you're able to do representation a lot better. The other thing that I want to talk on is with how is it an asset? That's usually a question of how is adding a more diverse component an asset. It's not just an asset for community, but it's an asset for the bar associations. When you pull in more factors, you get in more of a population, and therefore you're able to reach more. You're able, if we want to break it down to funding, if you want to do doing events, etc., exposure, knowledge, the amount of talent, you're able to have a wide range of pool when it comes to that. So it's not just an asset for the community, it's also an asset for the bar associations themselves.
I have one more question, but I also want to open it up to participants, since I know we have about 9 more minutes. If any participant wants to ask a question in the Q&A, please feel free to put it there and I'll read it and we'll address it. So the last question I have is, what are some of the, we've heard about why it's beneficial and the successes and the great things that it leads to, but what are some of the biggest challenges in implementing inclusion plans, and how have you or your bar associations been successful in addressing those?
I don't mind jumping in the front on this one. Oftentimes, and nobody on this panel needs me to tell them this, but I'm going to say it for the benefit of the group. Oftentimes, the people who need that representation are the ones who wind up doing all the work to get the representation. And I'm tired. I'm sure all of y'all are tired, but we have to keep pushing forward. And to me, that's the biggest obstacle, is we need people who don't have to carry it all the time to help us carry it across the finish line.
I will say that another barrier is to having plans is sometimes organizations will create a plan just because, it's the thing to do. It's, cool to have a diversity plan. It's cool to use the buzzwords, but they don't actually necessarily implement it, or they may do it the first year because someone was really passionate about it. But then there's like the follow through, like after that person's gone, it's like, okay, who's gonna take that mantle and continue to do it? But I think sometimes organizations struggle with that as well. And I think it's really important to, treat your plan as not something that you look at, every 5 years, but making sure that you're benchmarking and seeing how your plan is actually coming to life. It should be a living, breathing document. And to the extent that you need to update because something's not working, don't be afraid to do that.
So the point that Shenique illuminated on one end is because we joke offline, but in true life, many of us are following Shenique in her footsteps, right? So the point is, when she leaves, who carries the torch now, right? And here I am, juggling the best I can all these years. But jokes aside, the challenge I would pinpoint would be limited resources. In implementing the plan, it's a conversation I actually had with Robert Gray, former ABA press many years ago, and actually ironically discussed it with our ABA pres-elect, Deborah Enix Ross, yesterday, in a separate unrelated convo. And I mentioned this to her, and the same light bulb went off, yes. And it's a term that Robert and I use in talking, and he brought up before. It's called the diversity dollar. He said the diversity dollar is finite. There's limited resources that are available. Because all these causes, let's just get to the brass tacks. They take money. They take resources that we put behind them. That's fuel, right? You got to put gas in your car, and gas is also super expensive right now. So it is not easy to get from point A to point B on some of these initiatives and programs that sound great and they're lofty. And even if we're updating the plan every year, Shenique says we need to, and we do, guess what? How do we get there? We need fuel. The challenge is that I think implementing plans, because of the finite dollar, is that sometimes everybody's got a new group every year, right? A new project, a new initiative. That's great, but what about the other ones that exist too? Sometimes we need to actually be joining organizations and put our efforts together and or find ways to just collaborate. One of my favorite things to do is collab, right? Because you realize that many organizations, you have very similar causes, similar mission. You're trying to do the exact same thing, trying to do more working together instead of what happens is we cannibalize each other because we're asking the same organization. We were dealing with even the ABA, all of our sections, divisions, and forums that go out and fundraise. Well, guess what? The first thing anybody sees at the beginning of it is I'm the such and such division of the ABA, the section of the ABA. So it's like, okay, ABA already asked me 3 times in 3 different channels, and I gave already. I got nothing else in my corporate sponsorship budget. I'm sorry. Holler at me in 2023. So we have to find ways to not, step on each other's toes. And I think that's a big challenge. So the more we can work together, because, and let's be honest, there's a bit of an ego thing, I think, there that we have to think about as organizations. It's not about getting credit. It's about getting the work done. It's about making sure that people you're trying to benefit or bless get it done the best. I mean, that I will leave it at that.
That's good. And I'm glad I was muted when you said, I was like, amen.
Oh, I was on my soapbox. You probably felt it. I was like, let me get out of the full pitch because this is tight.
We do have a question from one of the participants. They obviously thank you guys for taking the time and opportunity to address the issues. They say they're from a small community in South Dakota, and they were wondering how to implement a mentorship opportunity for underrepresented individuals. Like, what's the best way to market to high school and middle school students and to get them and their parents interested in exploring legal careers?
If I could take this one. So finding bar associations are great because we do have the county ones and we have the state ones. But a more indirect way that then gets you to this route, because a lot of times the bar associations are more tailored towards law students, attorneys, judges, etc. Even along lawyers divisions, they're more towards once you are in law school or whatnot. South Dakota is a part of the Midwest region for BASA, the Black Law Association. And just a plug, I was their former vice chair of the region. And I actually implemented a mentoring program across, so for those who don't know, BASA spreads across 15 states. It's the largest geographical of the national BASA. And I implemented a programming, it's called It Takes One, that goes down to high schoolers all the way up, exposing them to the legal field. So getting involved with some of like the BASA or Women's Caucus, et cetera, they have the pipelines to the bar associations, which gives you the exposure a little bit sooner. The one that I was a part of is BASA. That's the one I know off the top of my head that does it, of trying to get to high schools and middle schools and undergrads that are not majoring in those more common law fields of poli-sci or criminal justice or stuff like that. And they do that was mentioned, the mock trials, doing stuff like that to do the exposure. But I'm gonna be honest, the hardest thing about it is the communication, getting the responses. There's so many times that we hold events and we're doing calls and et cetera, but we're not getting the responses. Therefore, it falls off the wagon. But connecting with the local law schools, which are then connected to there's a pipeline back to the bar associations, is a huge exposure of getting it earlier.
So I would like to add to that. I think one of the ways that we found that we've been able to reach, young people is going directly to the schools. To the extent that you have people in your bar association who, may sit on the school board or may have a wife or a husband, a kid who's a teacher, trying to get that personal connection and having them also kind of buy into the program is very helpful. Because I feel that in the programs that we've done that have been targeted to young people, I think you get a better response when you have buy-in from the school and when it's kind of like a school-wide program versus doing outreach directly to, the children and saying okay, we have this program. And that's just been my experience. I think another way, and former president of the ABA, Paula Brown did this, was going to the Boys and Girls Club of America. She did this 50 state thing where she went to various Boys and Girls Clubs around the country. I helped her do the one in Lansing. So I'm not exactly sure for South Dakota, kind of how your Boys and Girl Clubs are set up, but trying to maybe tap into groups that are already have that demographic of represented and underserved children would be a way to kind of at least have like a captive audience, because it'll be a part of the program for that particular day.
The YMCA also does something similar. The Boys and Girls Club is another avenue.
Yeah, simple, just nugget. I would just throw it, don't reinvent the wheel. And to echo what Bria and Shenique said, they're talking about existing organizations that you're able to tap into, or existing program. That's kind of similar to what I said before. I don't think you need to look too far and wide. Find those orgs that are serving the communities, that are non-legal organizations, non-bar association, and then that's where you bring that connective tissue in and say, but we're going to bring the lawyer side of this, the bar side of this, and then make the connection in the pipeline.
Awesome. So we are at the top of our hour. I wanted to take the time to thank our wonderful panelists. Like I told you at the beginning, they're brilliant, and now you saw it for yourselves. They're great. They're super involved. And because of that, have really great and rich experience for all of us. So thank you so much to the panelists for taking your time and your lunch hour to do this. We really appreciate you. Thank you to Daryl Wilson for the idea for the 4-part series. Again, another brilliant attorney who had a really great idea, and we're very grateful for your leadership. And thank you to all of the YLD, the ABA YLD leadership, for allowing us to put this on, all our sponsors and supporters, and last but not least, special thanks to Tracy and all ABA staff for putting this program together. So thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, y'all.